Planes were like glaring eyes as they passed overhead. Louise caught a glimpse of a young man with a leather aviator hat staring down at her from the first plane, and then the enemy planes were passed. The American seaplane was too far into its descent to pull up and flee. It came in gracefully, skating over the water as it slowed. Soldiers on the waterfront aimed small arms at the approaching Zeros, who ignored them. Instead, they trained their guns on the seaplane. The first Zero overshot its target. Its bullets disappeared harmlessly into the sea, and it raced past, banking around for another attack. The second and third, however, struck the American plane, and one of these shots punctured a fuel tank or engine. There was a muffled explosion, a geyser of flame, and the whole thing was on fire. The doors opened, and the crew flung themselves into the bay. By the time Louise got to the waterfront, the burning seaplane was already slipping beneath the waves. The Japanese fighters had turned around and were coming in to strafe the people on the shore. 2 Filipino soldiers with rifles took aim, while an American officer shouted and waved to get people to shelter in the nearby buildings. Suddenly, the officer's body danced a grotesque jig, and all around him men and women were screaming and falling as bullets tore through them. Louise threw herself to the ground for a second time. The noise was terrible. The sick taste of fear came up in her mouth. And then the enemy was gone. Not only had she forgotten about the injured civilians in the building, but she'd lost track of her companions. As she rose shakily to her feet, she saw that Maria Elena, Corporal Fares, and the dog were all uninjured. Maria Elena was crying, and Fares was still and pale, his brown eyes wide, as if he was in shock. The dog remained flattened on the ground, as if instinctively trying to make itself as small as possible. Louise's heart was ready to hammer free from her chest, but she didn't have time to be terrified. She found Dr. Claypool, who was already at work trying to stop the bleeding of a man whose leg was torn apart in the attack. He called for help. A woman stood next to him, but seemed not to hear his pleas. The woman's name was Frankie Dover, and she'd been chief nurse at the hospital. 12 years in the army, and an exacting, demanding head, but you wouldn't have guessed at her experience or authority, the way she stood rooted in place. Her face was slack with fear as she searched overhead. The blood of the injured man was spattered like red paint across her face and white dress, but she didn't seem to notice it. She only had eyes for the sky, for the feared return of the enemy. Louise pushed Frankie aside. She took off her cap and pressed it on the injured man's wound, allowing Claypool to remove his own hands and work. She didn't look at the wound, told herself it was just meat, just flesh. A little blood didn't bother her at all. That's what she told herself as she put her hands into a wound that looked like something from butchering day on the farm. The man writhed and screamed, tried to push her hands away. So much blood was leaking out, and the pain soon gave way to shock. By the time the doctor organized his instruments to enact an emergency roadside surgery, the wounded man was fading. There was nothing to be done for him, and he was soon dead in a small lake of blood. Soldiers came to ask if they could help, only to turn away, looking ill. 2 small miracles. First, the Japanese Zeros didn't return. They buzzed around over the city and flew south, where there was the sound of gunfire and artillery. Second, the attack had done less damage than Louise feared. The 3 soldiers, the American giving orders and the 2 Filipinos with rifles, were dead, as was the man she and Dr. Claypool tried to save. An older Filipina woman who nobody seemed to know, but someone thought might be the mother of one of the dead soldiers, had also died in the attack. An army lieutenant by the name of Kozlowski took charge of the survivors. First, he organized a rescue of the aviators who'd escaped the burning seaplane. Then he got a radio man to call for another evacuation. The radio man looked up after a tense, shouted conversation that seemed to involve someone incredulously squawking on the other end about the impossibility of sending in more planes. And trucks? Were they nuts?